are certainly strange times, and we know they have been times of acute suffering for many, but for all of us, really a dark and cloudy time of anxiety. And one of the few silver linings to this dark and cloudy time has been the opportunity for more reading. We may be socially distanced from each other, confined to our home, cut off from some of the human contact that we crave. But every day, each of us receives the invitation to enter new stories, new worlds, entertain new perspectives, and expand the breadth of our empathy and imagination through literature. And so it seems fitting to consider together the joys, opportunities, and challenges of reading in quarantine. And we're so glad to be joined in that by our guest today, Dr. Karen Swallow-Prior. Karen is a literature professor and a frequent writer on literature, culture, ethics, and ideas for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, First Things, Vox, Christianity Today, and many other publications. She's also the author of several works, including Booked, Literature in the Soul of Me, and On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through the Great Books. Karen, it's great to have you here.
It's great to be with you in this time of quarantine.
So Karen, one of the first things I have to ask, I noticed yesterday, just in looking at your Twitter feed, that your handle includes a nickname of the notorious KSP. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your notoriety.
Well, I think the brief version is simply that I have come to be known among both my friends and critics first as KSP, kind of my initials. And then, I do, without even really trying, attract a lot of criticism. I think I'm just a person who doesn't fit into everyone else's preconceived categories. And so I get a bit of criticism and trolling from all sides. And a friend came along and nicknamed me Notorious KSP a number of years ago. But with the latest round of criticism a few months ago, I just went ahead and changed my Twitter handle to reflect the reality.
Well, we are happy to have you here today, Notorious KSP.
Thank you for having me.
So you've now written 2 books on the joys of reading. And I wanted just to ask you, how did you become an avid reader, and what was the first book you loved?
Oh, goodness. I became an avid reader first because my mother read to me as a child. My earliest memories are being read to, and one of my most vivid memories is actually that moment when I was in my room reading Dr. Seuss, using my finger and reading the words out loud. And I played library when I was a child. I got all my books together and put them on a shelf in the basement and made my friends check them out. I don't know if they wanted to or not. And so I was just a proverbial child with my nose in a book. I wasn't necessarily reading, classic literature, but I read all the wonderful children's stories. I think I would, it's hard for me to pick which one really first impacted me, but I would say just at that age when I realized reading was such an important activity to me, Walter Farley's The Black Stallion series, I think, is one of the first series that really came alive to me as a young person. I loved horses and books. And so I just have read for all of my life until I became an English major and then an English professor.
So the first book that you wrote on reading itself, Booked, Literature in the Soul of Me, you described at one point as a love story. And I wanted to read how you described it because I just thought it was beautiful and would love for you to comment on it. You said, "It's the story of how my deep love of reading slowly meandered into a deep love of God. By reading widely, voraciously, and indiscriminately, I learned spiritual lessons I never learned in a church or Sunday school, as well as emotional and intellectual lessons that I never would have encountered within the realm of my lived experience. Most importantly, by reading about all kinds of characters created by all kinds of authors, I learned how to be the person God created me to be." So how did reading indiscriminately, even promiscuously, teach you spiritual, emotional, and intellectual lessons? And what do you think you learned?
Well, I do really, that is the story of that book, and I give a lot of them there. And, I did grow up in the church, and I've been a Christian since I was a very small girl. And somehow, I grew up in Sunday school and even teaching Sunday school. But somehow the books just took me outside of myself and my small world. I grew up in rural Maine. There's not a lot that happens there. So I was able to just cultivate an imagination through reading books. And the Sunday school answers always seemed too easy and too obvious. I kind of learned the do's and the don'ts. But when I read, for example, as a sophomore in college, Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, it changed my life because I recognized in the character something in myself that had never really been explained. And I learned how it just brought together a lot of the do's and the don'ts I learned in church into a more into life, a life that I didn't live, but I could watch someone else living and think about the same things that this character was thinking about and avoid the same mistakes that she made, really. And so that's just the story of my life, is reading these works of literature, seeing people and encounters, and watching them experience things that I wondered about and thought about, but didn't have to experience for myself, because I could just see how these worldviews had consequences in the lives of people, even though they were fictional people.
All of us are going through a hard time right now, and often what we read differs with the times that we're in. And you're no stranger to hardship. I think it was a few years ago, right after you finished writing your book on reading well, that you visited Nashville. You had a meeting with an editor, then you stepped off a curb and into the path of an oncoming bus, and were in the ICU for quite some time with a fractured pelvis and collapsed lungs and the like. What did you read while you were healing, and how did you make your selections?
Well, after that, those days of crisis in the hospital and being deeply medicated and getting through that initial part of it, a lot of people gave me books and sent me books. Once I got home and realized I had several months of recuperation ahead of me and bed rest, I thought, wow, I'll just sit around and read. It'll be kind of like a dream come true. And it really wasn't like that, I have to say, because the medication that I had, the pain medication I had to take, really does not help the mind function very well. So the thing that I remember most, especially in the hospital, is someone actually gave me an audio, a little box, a little Bible in a box that you can listen to. I don't even know what it's called. It just plays the Bible. And I listened to Job in the hospital. I had actually just been thinking about Job and writing my book and writing on suffering and patience. And that's a book that helps put my own suffering into perspective, and in a way that I never expected to. And then once I got home, I actually remember reading one book about the Lipizzaner horses in World War II. It was a history book someone sent me called The Perfect Horse. And that was a good escape for me. It was history. It was interesting. It took me a while, actually, before I could sit down and read a literary work, just because of just the psychological, the mental and intellectual and physical trauma. And it was not a time of just sitting around and reading as I would have hoped.
Right. You mentioned sort of the fog that the medicine had caused and how it hampered your own ability to read. But we're in a time, even before the quarantine, where reading in general seems to be in decline. Each generation reads less than the generation before it. They register less reading comprehension, even report less delight in reading. What do you think the implications are, for ourselves, for our souls?
Oh, I think the implications for ourselves, our souls, our society are great. I like to look at the long picture, say the 500-year chunk of time that we are in, well, I think toward the end of, because literacy, widespread literacy, the ability to read well, the accessibility of reading is not something that all of human history has been able to enjoy. The Protestant Reformation, among other cultural factors, helped to bring about widespread literacy and the technology required to make printed material widely available. And we are in the digital age, we have a lot of material to read, but we're not reading in the same way. cognitive science shows us over and over again, we're not reading this in the same way when we read on screens as we are when we're holding a thick book that we kind of lose ourselves in. And so I think what's at stake really is the kind of print culture, the kind of linearity and logical thinking that comes along with that, that we've been developing as a Western culture for 500 years. You know, we still have it, but I think that we could be losing it. I know myself, I feel my own attention span changing and my brain working in a different way because I'm so immersed in digital media. And so we need to think about the implications of that for our whole culture, really.
Mm-hmm. You know, in addition to just a decline of reading in general, there's a decline of reading literature in particular. And there also seems to be a marked gender difference in all of this. Men read far less than women, especially with novels and literature. Boys read less than girls. One of the things I've noticed too over the last several years is among many men, there almost seems to be a mark of pride. You know, I had one man I respected quite a bit tell me that he did not have time for make-believe when it comes to fiction. Oh, you're a literature professor, you love books, why should busy businessmen read literature?
I don't think there's any better way to cultivate leadership skills, human understanding, empathy, vision for the future than to read literature, to read fiction, literary fiction by and about people in different times and places. I mean, I think if we look past, you know, in this several 100-year period of great art and literature and culture in the Western world, we will see it was largely led by men because they were the ones who had access to education and social and political power. They were readers. They were not only reading this great imaginative literature, they were producing it. And they were learning different languages, and the richness that you obtain in your thinking and your understanding of not just human beings, but even the way language works should cause everyone to begin reading. We know that the people who are leading are the good communicators, and communication is mastery of language. And nothing hones our skills in language more than reading the art that uses language as its tool, and that's literature.
Now, in your books, you assert that there is a link between reading well and virtue. Maybe you could unpack that a little bit for us.
Sure. That was writing that book was kind of a journey. It wasn't even the book that I set out to write, but I have, you know, as a lifelong or nearly lifelong Christian, I have thought through about the first half of my adult Christian life in terms of Christian worldview, which is kind of integrating biblical concepts and principles into every part of our life. And that's kind of been my way of approaching and thinking for a number of years. But then I encountered the thinking of writers such as another Trinity Forum fellow, James K.A. Smith, who has written a number of books on the way that we are liturgical creatures. We develop our loves and our practices through what we do. The more we do something, the more we develop a desire for that thing, and we train our desires through the practices that we engage in, whether they're conscious or deliberate or not. And so I began to think about how my lifelong practice as a reader has cultivated not only the love for reading that we've talked about, but even the kind of empathy and understanding that people who know me well observe that I have. And it's not like it's something that I've tried to gain. It's something I see now has come through this lifelong practice of reading and the practice of seeing the world through other people's eyes and understanding how their language shapes their perception of what's happening to them. So once I began to think about that, I began to think about all of the different virtues, the classical virtues such as prudence and temperance and courage and humility. And so I just sat down to study those and to see not only how we can see lessons about them in literature, because that's one way of approaching literature, but how actually the reading of literary works can cultivate those virtues in us more than just through the form of the literature, not just the content of the lessons. So that's what the book is kind of about.
So there are many different kinds of reading. You know, a lot of times the reading that we do, we're essentially skimming over a text as quickly as we can, you know, trying to essentially strip mine the top layer for information and move on. There's other kinds of reading described by like Eugene Peterson and Eat This Book that is deeper, slower, more reflective, more contemplative. And I think it was Pascal who said that you need to read at the right pace to properly understand any book. So maybe you can walk us through what it means to read well. How does one do this?
I really think that the practice that we need to intentionally cultivate in this day and this age is reading more slowly. Everything in our culture today is about hurry, and even the reading that we do, as you just mentioned. A lot of things should be skimmed, let's be honest. Twitter feeds, newspaper articles, blogs, I mean, instruction manuals, emails. We spend a lot of our reading time skimming because the purpose of it is simply to get information, and that's fine. But what's happening as the more we skim and the more we read in this sort of superficial, shallow way, the less developed that sort of area of the brain that does the deep reflective reading is. It's really not the same thing. It's like, you know, it's like filling up at McDonald's and then wondering why you don't enjoy the 7-course gourmet meal that's been set before you as much as you thought you would. It's just a different kind of approach. And again, I'm experiencing it myself. When I sit down to read a book, a work of literature, poetry, if I've been spending the last hour scrolling Twitter or you know, answering emails, I have to force my brain to kind of shift into a different mode and to read in this deeper, slower, reflective way. So my number one tip to everyone who wants to just read better and read literary works is slow down. Read more slowly, read out loud, stop, pause, reflect. It's not a race. It's about quality, not quantity.
You mentioned this, and yet those who follow you know that you are quite the master of social media. You seem to be everywhere on Twitter. You have a very vibrant Facebook presence. How do you manage to sort of navigate or negotiate the very different kinds of thinking, communication, and comprehension that social media requires with the deep reading that constitutes part of your day job?
Well, I'll have to completely admit that I don't think I manage it well. It really does feel like a competition, and there's a tension. It's something that I struggle with and think about. I mean, the inner me, the real KSP, would love to be Wendell Berry, right? And to be not on social media at all. That is the desire of my heart. I would love that. Yet there's a sense in which I feel called, and I feel a confirmation of that call and receive confirmations of that call nearly every day to be a presence on social media. It is something I believe that I am good at, and that's just kind of an embarrassing thing. It's not like something that I dreamed of being when I was a little girl, was good at Twitter. But it is a calling, it is a need. And I want to bridge that gap. And if I'm leading people to do more of the reflective, contemplative work and reading off of social media, then I hope so. But each summer, as my semester ends and I can relax a little more and do more of my own reading, since I'm not teaching, I do think more about I'm able to focus more on the practices of deep reading. And I want to begin that even more in this quarantine, which is why I was so excited to do this forum, because I think when we have a big shift like this in our lives, it's a good time to re-examine and set back, and maybe we can develop some new habits and practices that we can take with us when all of this ends. And that's what I'm working on right now as I'm finishing up my online classes for the semester.
What new habits and practices are you working on now?
Well, I'm going to start working on being very intentional and disciplined about, for example, putting my phone aside for, an hour. If I sit down with a book, not having my phone nearby so that I can read longer. Heading out into my garden to do some yard work. And again, because my daily work requires me to answer student emails, answer administrative emails, it's just as easy, you know, when I'm doing my actual work, I can also be checking Twitter and Facebook. But when I'm done with that, then I have fewer excuses to be doing the social media. That is, quite frankly, we all know it, and the developers admit it. It's addictive. They put in addictive aspects of it to keep us drawn in so that there will be more clicks and more selling and so forth. And so I think it's just a matter of being intentional about our use and when we're going to put it down and not use it for a while.
What are you reading now during quarantine?
Well, I very seldom read for fun during the semester because I'm always prepping for class and I always have papers to grade. But with the putative extra time we all have because I'm not commuting, right? I read so far in the past, beginning with the spring break, that was I think 3 weeks ago, I read Wendell Berry's Hannah Coulter, which is a novel. Wendell Berry is known for his nonfiction and his poetry even, but he's also written novels. And right now I'm finishing up Willa Cather's O Pioneers, 2 works of rural agricultural life. I don't think that's coincidental. I think I'm feeling, you know, that nostalgia for that simpler life that we're all being forced to face. And I want to immerse myself in a world where there wasn't any other option.
I was wondering if you were delving into Robinson Crusoe, but
Berry
seems a happier medium there. One of the metaphors that you use in your book repeatedly, which I thought was really beautiful and wanted to ask you about, was you frequently compare reading to a friendship. You know, in that reading well adds to our life the way that having a friend adds to our life. Just last week, we were talking with psychiatrist and neuroscientist Kurt Thompson, who talked about how relationships and what we pay attention to literally rewire our mind. They rewire neurons. And in many ways, your metaphor there seemed a different way of sort of unpacking that reading changes us the way that having a friend changes us. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting too is that time spent on electronic media is correlated with essentially unsocial, even antisocial or socially disengaged practices. The more time you spend on social media, the less likely you are to spend time on friendships with other people engaged in civic activities, the less likely you are to volunteer or to give to charities. With reading, all of the associations and correlations seem pro-social. That is, the more time you spend reading, the more likely you are to vote, to give, to volunteer, to give time to friendships. And I wanted to ask you about what it is about reading, which is a solitary and isolated activity, that lends itself to engagement in the way that other storytelling media do not.
That is such an excellent question. And of course, when the novel first began to arise in the early 18th century and then grew in popularity in the 19th century, a lot of social critics were very worried about these young people sitting in rooms by themselves reading books. It seems sort of like a revolutionary activity, actually. That's a whole history in and of itself. And so, you know, so we have to have that sort of measured understanding that we don't always understand the effects of the cultural medium of our time. And that's probably true of digital media as well. But I just, you know, when we're on digital media, when we're reading tweets or Facebook posts or whatever, we're reading to respond. We're reading to like, oh, what's my response going to be? How am I going to react to that? But when we're reading a book, we're reading a work of literature, it's the kind of conversation we get to think and reflect, but we can't respond in that sense. Mm-hmm. It's like sitting down to coffee with someone and hearing their story, and we don't get to interrupt. We have to just listen to what is happening to them, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and we can make our judgments in our mind and, you know, make our observations, but we don't get to respond. we're just listening in a metaphorical way. And we don't do that on social media because we have that opportunity. And in fact, we're encouraged and prompted and enticed to respond quickly and more. And literature is the exact opposite. We're just listening and seeing the world through someone else's eyes.
So in one of your works, you quote this wonderful passage by philosopher Martha Nussbaum, and I'm going to read it and just ask for you to respond to it. I think it's really beautiful. She said, "We have never lived enough. Our experience is, without fiction, too confined and too parochial. Literature extends it, making us reflect and feel about what might otherwise be too distant for feeling. The point is that in the activity of literary imagining, we are led to imagine and describe with greater precision, focusing our attention on each word, feeling each event more keenly." And so I wondered if you could do a little bit of on-air reflection and perhaps tell us about a time where your own immersion in literature enabled you to more keenly empathize with someone else or more wisely perceive the reality of the situation you were in.
Yeah, so many books have done that for me. Let me see if I can think of a one that's done that especially powerfully. It's actually one that I wrote about in On Reading Well. It's a short story by George Saunders called 10th of December. And just sort of a little caveat out for anyone out there listening. George Saunders is a very edgy writer. He's dark. He's difficult and not light. But what he does, his craft, is that he really gets inside the character's mind, and he writes in a way that reflects the way such a character might think. And so in the story of 10th of December, he brings us into the mind of a young, romantic, foolish boy who's unpopular at school and has retreated to his world of imagination. And then also the mind of a man who is dying of terminal cancer. And he brings these two characters together in a way that literally changes their lives. And the way that Saunders writes allows us to just kind of see the world through each of these characters who are very different from me. I've never been a 10 or 12-year-old boy, and I've never been a man, with terminal cancer. And yet I have experienced things that are very similar to what those characters have gone through. And, with suicide and attempted suicide in my family and in my circles. And that is something that the story centers on. And so that kind of combination of familiarity and strangeness, the commonality that we share, and then the particularities of those experiences. I mean, that's what literature does for us. It holds both of those things in tension. We can read about someone so vastly different from us in a world vastly different from our own, and yet the words that they use, the images that they use, are ones that are also familiar and that we can bring back to our world and see in the same way. This is really what poetry does too, in a more condensed way. Poetry is just, if you boil down what poetry is making connections. Using metaphors, using similes, using language to connect one thing to another. And our whole life as human beings is really about connection. It's about connections with our family, with our friends. It's about making connection of one idea with another, connecting this principle with that political candidate. We're trying to connect everything all the time. And language is the medium by which we do that. And it's unique to being a human being. And so it is just part of what it means to be human. And so reading literature just enriches and develops that ability in us.
You mentioned at the very outset, when I asked you about your nickname, the notorious KSP, that you've had some controversy lately. And one of the things I noticed in your book On Reading Well, which to all of our viewers we definitely recommend, was you talk about many of the different virtues, including the fairly unfashionable virtue of temperance. In many ways, the last decade, 5 years or so, it often seems that the extremes and acting along the lines of extremes, the fracture that extremes and polarizing rhetoric and actions have actually been valorized, even sacralized in both political and religious spheres. And I wondered what your own reading has, how it's affected you in both thinking about the virtue of temperance, about thinking about our own polarized times, and in dealing with some of the controversy you've had to face over the last couple of years.
Well, I think, in the most literal sense, the way that we've been talking about, reading has expanded my empathy and perspective so that it's just easy for me to kind of understand someone else's point of view, even if we disagree. Whether maybe that's something that's just also, I'm hardwired to do that, but it's just easier for me to see the perspective of someone else. And so being able to see both sides, so to speak, I think that in itself tempers my response to someone that I disagree with. I also think, temperance is the virtue that moderates our, our physical passion so that we don't, indulge too much or too little. And we often think of it as just simply either restraint or excess, that we think of those terms, as you mentioned. But virtue itself, the definition of virtue itself is a moderation. It's the absence of the quality that in its excess becomes a vice, or the quality that in its deficiency becomes a vice. And we just live in a culture that tends to think, well, if something's good, then more of it is better, or if something's bad, then none of it is good. And temperance and virtue itself show us that even that moderation itself is a virtue. And I don't mean in terms of being lukewarm or being, compromising, but simply not being excessive and not being deficient. And temperance points us to that. It's the most sort of literal of the virtues. It's because it's centered on, in Aristotelian terms, it's centered on food and drink and sex. And we have to have food to live, but we shouldn't have too much. And we have to reproduce if the human race is going to continue. And so it's just about bringing all of these things into moderation. And that is a model for everything that we do. A time to be silent, a time to speak up, a time to listen, a time to speak out. The Bible has lots of wisdom about this, and the ancients did as well, because they were made in God's image as well, and God's truth, all truth is God's truth.
So we have couple of dozen questions all lined up from our viewers for you. So we won't be able to get through all of them, but we will get through the ones that we can. And the two with the most upvotes, I'm actually going to combine and give to you together so you can answer them both. The first one is, if you had to choose one or two novels for all college students to read, which would you choose? And the second question, which is related somewhat to that, is, classic works aside, what are some contemporary literary fiction works that you would recommend?
Okay. So classic, two works that all college students should read. Now, I do want to give the caveat that my specialty is British literature. So I just tend to think of British literature and not American literature. I suppose, so I almost, it's harder for me to answer. So just in terms of the kinds of things that I teach in British literature, I would say Pride and Prejudice, because it is not. It is not a love story. The people who haven't read it think, oh, Jane, it's because if they've seen the films are generally bad. All of Jane Austen is satire, it's comedy of manners. It's really about how we can and should conduct ourselves and correct ourselves in society. And love and marriage are just kind of the object lessons. And then I think probably the most important novel for a college student especially, because it really is about becoming, well, it comes that quote that you drew from Booked earlier, was in the context of becoming who God created us to be. And Jane Eyre is the novel that is about that journey of each soul to become who it is supposed to be, and to resist all of the temptations, even the good temptations, because sometimes we're tempted to do good things, but that are not good for us. And that's really what Jane Eyre is about. And even though, again, it centers on a female character, it is really an allegory of the human soul.
That's great. So our next question is from Bethany, who asks, can you discuss the differences between reading on a digital device or audiobooks versus an ink and page book?
Well, there is a lot of research out there on this, and I think there needs to be more. And the and you can get one of the most hotly contested tweets that I've sent in the past few months had to do with whether audiobooks are the same as reading. And wow, people really get worked up about that. There is ample research indicating that when we read something digitally, we're actually using a different part of our brain than we are when we're reading a printed page. So there is a difference. I've only seen a little bit of research, and there could be more out there on the audiobooks, and what I saw indicated that seems to replicate a written page more so than the screen. I think it's all good. I just reading is reading, but I definitely, and I'm learning to listen to audiobooks. I'm incorporating that more into my regimen. I listen to audiobooks when I'm running, but they are generally entertaining books that are light because I just can't concentrate through listening enough to pay attention to a literary work. But I am definitely very biased toward that physical object, that aesthetic form that we can hold in our hands and turn and smell and touch and know where we are in location, like just feeling the weight of it and knowing how many more pages we have to go. There's just a physicality and a geographical and aesthetic sense of experiencing a book in our hands. That's not scientific, that's just me. Take it or leave it for what it's worth.
So Noelle asked, do you have specific practices you use to process your reading, such as journaling or something else?
Yeah, that's a good question. I am not much of a journaler. I never have been. I do, when I'm just reading literature, I just read with a pen in my hand, and I just underline or make notes of the things that I love. And even if I'm reading for fun, for example, this Willa Cather book that I'm almost finished with, I just thought, well, I don't need a pen for this. I'm just reading it to enjoy it. And then, no, I've got to go find a pen because this sentence is so well written. It's just so beautiful. I want to, it's just something I remember it more. I can look back for it more. And I do use Post-it notes sometimes. It just depends on what I'm the purpose of my reading.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm sitting down to do research to write a book, then, then I'm taking notes and marking things and trying to be more organized. But just reading a book for fun, a work of literary fiction, a pen in hand. And,
no highlighter, just a pen.
Oh, yeah, no highlighter, no pencil. It has to be a pen.
So Bob Freiling asks, what do you think is most helpful to strengthen greater biblical literacy in Bible reading?
That's an excellent question. And I do think that reading literary works does that. We use the same skill to read a literary work well that we use to read the Bible well. I mean, obviously the Bible is a different kind of book in many ways, and we have the aid of the Holy Spirit in understanding and applying it. But in years past, the best students that I have had have been the Bible majors who were also either taking an English class or doing a double major. Those were the best students that I have had because the hermeneutics of biblical studies informs the hermeneutics that we use when reading literature and vice versa. The skills are very much the same and the practices are the same. And so I think the two go hand in hand.
Great. So Rich Dugan asked, I haven't read much literary fiction. What are one or two recommendations to start with?
Well, again, Jane Austen is wonderful. And if you go in knowing that she's writing satire, I think sometimes people think, oh, it's just supposed to be a love story, and they don't know that the funny parts are really supposed to be funny. This is why I'll just maybe you're going to do this, but I'll just go ahead and do my little self-promotion. This is the reason why I have embarked on this series of reintroducing classic literature with B&H Publishers. I have a 6-volume series coming out. The first 2 have just come out. It's Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, which is a little lesser read work of hers, so I wanted to choose that. And Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is a very dense, dark work. And I have written introductions that are designed to help readers who aren't accustomed to reading literary fiction, and added discussion questions that you can read either before or after, depending on whether you want the spoilers or not. This is exactly why I have produced these books, is because I want to help people who are not accustomed to reading literary fiction do so. And I just talked this morning on a radio program where someone said, and this is my goal accomplished, that she feels like the introductions and discussion questions I'm asking are helping her not only with this work, but also are training her how to read literary fiction in general. And that's what I want. It is a skill, and no one should feel badly because they don't know the skill. I don't feel badly when I sit down to the television, there's a sports ball game on and I don't know what's going on. I need to know the language and the vocabulary and what to look for, just like people reading literary fiction need to know, oh, what am I supposed to look for? Or what am I supposed to notice? We all need help and practice in that, and that's what I want to offer.
So Callie asked, what is your favorite Wendell Berry book?
Well, so far, in terms of fiction, I've only read Hannah Coulter, so that's my favorite novel of his. And I've been reading his poetry, and so probably my favorite work is his poem. I think it's called "How to Be a Poet," and it's beautiful. So, and of course, his essays are excellent. But right now, I guess I would have to say it's Hannah Coulter, his novel.
So Ben has a question I think a lot of people can relate to. Ben writes, I love to read, but I find myself in a pandemic fog with a reduced ability to read long form. Mm-hmm. Though I'm working to keep exposure to the news, social media, etc., at a minimum to help maintain some level of focus, I still find myself distracted. Mm-hmm. Do you have any suggestions for navigating and cultivating deeper reading during this time?
I'm right there with you. I've been struggling too. I really thought that I would have a more peaceful, less distracted last few weeks. I also have been drawn to the news cycle. I'm just sort of weaning myself off of it. And so I'll go back to the fast food analogy. I mean, I think it's just, if we can get in our minds that you cannot go to McDonald's and eat and then sit down to this gourmet meal. You have to abstain from McDonald's if you want to enjoy the 5-course meal. So because our brain, it's not just that we're not using our brain one way when we're not reading good literature. We're using it in a different way. And so it's the same. Maybe a sports metaphor will help. I'm not very good with the sports, but if you're running sprints all the time, it can help you with your long distance running, but you still have to do the long distance training because they're not the same thing. And so I think we just have to accept the fact that it takes discipline and intentionality to abstain from those other kinds of brain activities so that we can settle into the others. And you don't have to pick up Dostoevsky today and start in on that. Start with some poetry, start with some sort of short verse or a novella, or whatever it is that can keep your attention for a longer time, even if it's like Stephen King. You start with that so that you can just wean yourself off of that news cycle and spend some time immersed in long form.
Cheryl asks this question. So many of the classic English works are steeped in Christian language, values, etc., but our culture is increasingly secular and biblically illiterate. How do you think this affects people's desire to read and appreciate great novels?
Yeah, that's a good question. So much of this past several hundred years worth, or even more, of great literature is just immersed in Christian language and culture. Now, that doesn't mean it's really Christian, but to appreciate it, to even Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare's his plays, his poems are just, I mean, he just reflects a biblical culture, a Christian worldview. And I think maybe if Christians who don't read literary, it might be an encouragement or enticement for them to know that and to realize I can read Shakespeare and look for the Christian ideas and the Christian principles. That can be a help. If you really want to get kind of down into the details of it, one thing that you can definitely do is buy works of literature that have good footnotes and good annotations to them, so that you can catch the allusions that we might not otherwise catch. It's so easy to buy the cheap editions that are reprinted on Amazon, and I'm not, there's nothing wrong with that, but you would be amazed at how much more you can get out of a work if you just get an edition that has even just a few footnotes. And I'm not even talking about, scholarly apparatus or something, but just that has some explanatory notes. You can get so much more out of it. So that's what I would recommend. I'm not sure I answered the question. I got off on a little bit of a trail there.
That's great. So a question from Becky Imperial, who asked, how can a teacher of elementary or middle school age kids encourage them not only to read, but to read well?
That is a great question. I think approach reading in all of the ways. I remember being in 4th and 5th grade and not only being assigned to read books on my own and do book reports and those things, but the teacher also set aside time and read aloud, would pick up a novel, Island of the Blue Dolphins. We would go through that and she would read it to the class. So we were being read to, we were being assigned to read outside the class. Encourage young people to read things that they really like. So that they cultivate a desire to read. Definitely encourage them to read more than Harry Potter. Harry Potter's great, but I'm finding more and more students coming up who fell in love with reading through Harry Potter who are not reading other things. They just sort of only know that. So it's can be a balance. You want them to read things they enjoy and love, but also kind of expand that. And so I think, again, reading widely, reading to them, having them write and comment about what they're reading, maybe have little discussion groups, because it can be very infectious to have conversations, good, lively conversations about what we're reading, like we're doing here.
Mm-hmm. One of our guests on a previous podcast, actually, Dana Joya, who's the Poet Laureate of California, had said at one point that the best possible way for parents to encourage their kids to read is intuitively to read to them. He said the second best way is perhaps less intuitive, which is to read in front of them. And essentially to model the fact that there is something so attention grabbing and engaging, even more than that it piques students' interest. Is that something you have noticed or seen in your own students and their backgrounds?
That's a good question. I get them later, and I don't see them really in their family context. So I don't, and I get English majors. They're already lovers of reading. I may have to start just asking that. How did they develop this love of reading? And is it something that's modeled for them at home? Most of what they say, it tends to be more that they're sort of the outliers, and they have to sort of explain themselves and explain their choice of major to their families. But in some ways, maybe it's always been that way.
So a question from Paul, who said, if losing long form reading has dire consequences, are there strategies for recovering it, both for our generation and the next?
Yeah, it's so, of course there are strategies, but again, it has to be intentional. There's a lot of cultural histories will make this observation. I'm thinking, I think Jean Edward Veith is someone who introduced me to this idea in one or two of his books, but this idea that during the so-called Dark Ages, it was the monks in the monasteries who were preserving the written word, the Bible itself, and all the extra biblical literature. The barbarians were raging outside the monastery walls. The world was falling apart and into chaos. And it was the Christians who were preserving the word, this time, in this case, by hand, copying over years and years. And here we are at the end of this era, whatever it is, slipping from modernity into post-modernity or whatever follows. And again, it can be and should be, and we don't know if it will be, the Christians who are preserving it's easy to preserve the written word now, but what we really need to preserve now is the ability to read well and to read long form. This is why I've never gone to or taught in a classical Christian school, but man, those institutions are doing this work. Kudos to them. Christian educators are, English departments everywhere hopefully are, some more or less. I mean, they've been kind of taken over by ideologies and political agendas over the love of literature. But if, we just as the monks were intentional and we're doing this work on purpose, we need to do it as well. Because the people in power will always be the people who know how to use language well. And so we can either, give it over to them, or we can be the ones who steward this wonderful gift of literacy and think all of the thinking and understanding and ability to perceive truth from falsity that comes with it.
Just to follow up on that, Christians are people who worship the word, or people of the book.
Yes.
And one would think there would be a deep love of reading almost baked in to a Christian subculture. And yet it's, when you look at different, basically just time use studies, there doesn't seem to be any significant difference in time spent reading between Christians and non-Christians. Why have we as Christians lost a love of a reading culture?
Well, I think the short answer is that we have just been influenced by the culture, right? I mean, the surrounding culture has lost it, and we're just kind of going along that way. But that this is giving up our rightful heritage, because, as you said, we are a people of the book. We are people who are centered on the word, capital W and even small w. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Jesus Christ is called the Word, that is his actual name. So we know that there's something significant and important and essential to our faith that is rooted in the Word of God, the Bible, but also the Word of Christ, and all of the small w words that reflect him. If we give this up and if we forget this heritage, then we really are just allowing the culture to win.
So we're rapidly running out of time, but we'll take two more questions here. One question asks, do you have any recommendations for books to read in community with friends, or books to engage a group of friends or family member to become closer?
I think that's a wonderful idea, to use books in this way. You can just simply look at the bestseller lists and see, because if you're talking about trying to kind of reach a wide variety of readers, I know Beth Moore and I did a little Twitter book discussion over Christmas break on Where the Crawdads Sing, which was a book that just was kind of, taking off and taking the world by storm. And books like that are, they have some literary quality, but they're also pretty accessible. And so there's so many out there like that. It's not hard to find good books. I would suggest that you read reviews and kind of know what you're getting into, because there's so many different kinds of books for different kinds of people. It's easy to pick the wrong one. And that's why I'm always hesitant to make specific recommendations, because there are just so many books, and I just want people, if you don't like one that you pick up, there are others. And so there are lots of good resources. I put out a list a couple of weeks ago about books to read in a pandemic at Religion News Service. And again, it just depends on your taste and the mood. So there is a lot of value in making the right choice, but you can do a little research to make sure you're picking one that will be that will satisfy the audience that you have in mind.
And so our last question is it an unpardonable sin to read an abridged version of a classic literature book? If not, how do you decide when to read the abridged version of a book as opposed to the unabridged?
Well, this goes back to the question about young people. I think introducing young people to classic works of literature through abridged versions is great. In terms of adults reading them, I'm not, unless it's maybe Les Miserables and it cuts out a lot of the sewage, the descriptions of the sewers, maybe that's acceptable. I think it's fine. I don't haven't read any abridged versions of anything, so I can't say for sure, but I think, you know, I think if it introduces you, that's okay. But it's important to remember that with literature, the form is just as important, if not more important, than the content. And that's why, even though I joked about Les Miserables, the reason why there's so much description about the sewage system is because the form of that description actually gives you a sense of the intricacies of that system. There's a reason that it's there. And so when we shorten the form, we're actually cutting out the content. And so I think it would be better to just read a work that you know, an entire work that you want to read, rather than less of one that you don't want to read. If that
In
makes
just a second, Karen, I'm going to ask you to kind of sum us up with a final word. But I do want to thank everyone for joining us. Those of you who missed us last week, we were delighted to be able to host psychiatrist and neuroscientist Kurt Thompson on Redeeming Shame, Believing a Truer Story. That video content is available on our website at www.ttf.org, as well as our YouTube channel. And next week, same time, we'll have the delight of hosting Senior Fellow Joe LeConte, who will be speaking about suffering, friendship, and courage, what C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien have to teach us about resilience and imagination in the midst of hardship. A video from this conversation with Karen Swallow Prior will be available later today, or certainly by tomorrow morning, and we hope that you'll share that with people who are interested as well. And as the witching hour approaches, Karen, I was hoping you could just leave us with a last word, either a summing up or a final thought.
All right, I'm going to cop out. Oh, actually, no, I think I'm going to do better than that. I'm going to read Pied Beauty by Gerard Manley Hopkins, one of my favorite poems, because I just can't do better than that, I think. So is that all right?
That's great.
All right. He loved words, and I hope this entices you to love them more. Pied Beauty. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-coal chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him.
Karen, thank you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And to all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great weekend and happy reading.